Nick Carboni makes his weekly appearance to give his thoughts on the end of the regular season. It's coming up next. Locked On Hornets.
You are Locked On Hornets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
In a minute, cuz we live.
It's Locked On Hornets. It's part of the Locked On Podcast Network. It's your team every day. Thanks for making us your first listen. We're free and available anywhere you get your pods. That includes YouTube, where if you're watching us there, you see that Nick Carboni of WCNC joins us. Once again, you can find him on Twitter at Nick Carboni WCNC. No Doug today, just going to be us two talking about what is the close to the end of the Hornets regular season. Doug has a baby, plus this has been a brutal year to watch, so he just needs one more break before he comes back on. And then we can talk a little bit more about prospects, get his thoughts on kind of a reflection mode, Nick, which is what I want to do here with this being your last episode before the final two games actually hit, before you join next week. Brutal. I mean, just a brutal season altogether. And we were trying to have this conversation. I know we were on WFNZ. I don't even know if we've had it here on Locked On Hornets, though. You can't salvage the way that this season went by having some nice development pieces. James Bouknight, some of the stuff that's happened at the end, Mark Williams. Like, I'm not trying to completely salvage the whole season by some of the nicer storylines at the end. But just overall, how much has this at least put a stop to the awful momentum, seeing Mark Williams, as soon as he entered the rotation, doing the whole 3-game winning streak, going in the Western Conference play-in tournament and wrecking it by playing, getting a couple wins against Dallas, which has, led to their spiral, getting a win against OKC. Are you at least ending on as positive a possible note as you can, given how the season ended? Or am I spinning it too hard? Feel free to say shut up.
Possible. There are some feel goods coming into the end of this season, but then I zoom out even further than this season, and I think about all the momentum that they had for the 3 seasons prior heading into this year, and what this year was supposed to be before really, the first domino fell, and that was Miles Bridges' arrest and subsequent, not playing all season. And then all of the injuries that happened. I think I've kind of consumed this season in phases and went through stages, I guess, of
grief. Okay,
there's
denial,
some injuries.
Acceptance.
Yeah, exactly. Whatever those stages are of being a Hornets fan this year, we've gone through them. LaMelo's injured in the preseason, but he'll be back. Remember trying to do the math of when he's going to come back and what that will mean. There's other injuries they're dealing with now. Okay, well, when they get through that, they're playing well right now through that. They had that stretch where they were playing really well early under Steve Clifford. So you thought, okay, he's really instilling some of his principles early on. And then the injuries compounded, and then they clearly hadn't shed a lot of those bad habits. And then before you know it, the season just kind of spun out and was lost. And I think that was the feeling the majority of the season. But you're right. In these last couple of weeks, you've had the wins over Dallas, which I think were awesome, and really a testament to Steve Clifford's coaching, and the player development that we've seen the last couple of weeks has been nice to see too. So you're right. It is ending on a positive note, but when you just factor in all the positive momentum they had coming into this year and how that is completely reverse track, it's still got to be really frustrating.
No, it is. And again, the positive note being, okay, at least we're not throwing out, I don't know, Terry Rozier, Kelly Oubre, everybody is suffering again. And you at least have some nights from James Bouknight, who gets an unexpected opportunity.
We thought he was, a week or so ago, did we think he was coming back to the NBA with the Charlotte Hornets? I didn't. I thought he was just going to be stuck there forever until they found a new NBA home for him. But to see him come back and clearly kind of, take ownership of his game a little bit has been nice to see. And Bryce McGowan's the other night going for 20 was good too.
Yeah, that's what we wanted to see. Doug and I had talked about that, wanting to see the blow up game from Bryce McGowan's, where he comes in and he has his 20-point performance, kind of like what Svi did against Toronto a couple nights before that. and at least having that career high. So we've gotten some nicer storylines, but again, it's going to be tough to salvage it, Nick, because injuries, if we look at how to define this year outside of injuries, is there any, like, I can't think of anything else, because that injury report the Hornets released before going into this last game was absolutely ridiculous. It was the top 7 players, and then they added Mark Williams onto it. Okay, so then he doesn't play. You're talking about your top 8 guys. Your top 8 players in your rotation are not seeing the floor. And I'm sure it's happened out there. I don't have an eye on every single night for every single NBA franchise. But man, even in tank mode, right? Even when teams are so blatantly tanking, it's hard for me to imagine that there've been too many times where the top 8 players in your rotation just don't suit up for what are legitimate injuries, by the way, right? Like maybe you hold them out a little bit more so they don't get further in.
They're going to play if it matters. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. If it matters, for sure, they're going to play, and they just don't, because there is a legitimate injury attached that we saw that either one of these players were dealing with, and they really couldn't suit up.
Yeah. First of all, did we think Svi Mihalu would be contributing this much when we barely mentioned his name at the end of that trade? I mean, honestly, that's been a revelation for me. Like, maybe this guy's got something that we didn't know about. I think Steve Clifford's probably enjoying these last few weeks because, he gets to just be in development and coach mode. I mean, Steve Clifford, one of his favorite things to say, and I'm paraphrasing, is like, you just, as a coach, you wake up in the morning and you see who's available and you just go from there. So just knowing that, okay, I'm not going to have the veteran guys. I'm not going to have LaMelo Ball. I've just got to coach. And he coaches his tail off. And I think, I obviously never thought this season was his fault, but, it was tough to watch this team, even at close to full strength, never really full strength, still not take to some of his coaching, his teachings, his principles, things that he wanted to bring here. But I think they are a little bit now as we go towards the end of the season. I think you're seeing some of that set in. And I think that does bode well for, him coming back next year, which I think will be the case unless there is an ownership change.
Yeah, and let's talk a little bit more about that and some of the other reflection points on the season. Coming up next on the Locked On Hornets podcast.
Don't go to sleep on the Hornets just yet.
Let's talk a little bit more about the way that the Hornets finishing the season, injuries, of course, too, but maybe there are a couple of other storylines that we need to pay attention to. We can talk about that in just a moment. This episode is brought to you by Ibotta. Look, groceries, school shopping, and getting a little something for yourself can be expensive. It doesn't matter what you're spending money on. You're already doing it, so why not get cash back for it? And you can do that with Ibotta. You can earn cash back on every shopping trip. Ibotta gives you cash back on hundreds of grocery items, from produce to personal care to pantry goods. And you can either link your loyalty account or upload your receipt after you shop at Ibotta and get your cash back. It's that easy. The average Ibotta user usually gets back about $120 per year in real cash back. That could cover the cost of an entire shopping trip alone, or you could use your cash back to buy that flight you've been eyeing, that game you're dying to go to, or the fancy dinner you've been craving as well. Right now, Ibotta is offering our listeners $5 just for trying Ibotta by using the code LOCKED when you register. Just go to the App Store or Google Play Store and download the free Ibotta app and use code LOCKED. That's Ibotta, IBOTTA, Ibotta in the Google Play or App Store, and use code LOCKED. More Locked On Hornets coming up next. So a couple of the things, I think, if we want to go with what we learned, let's do a season-ending what did we learn edition. If we do that, I think you look at, one, the effect that LaMelo Ball has on this team, both offensively and defensively. So one, extremely nice, and one, not so much. So if you look offensively, the Hornets team was night and day. I mean, they were as bad an offensive team in the NBA without him. And then he's thrown into the equation, and they're one of the better offensive teams, even with Steve Clifford. The impact he has on that end of the floor is immense. And you saw that time and time again, even when it was really hard for him to establish a rhythm, because before he eventually was out for the rest of the season, LaMelo was going back and forth with the ankle injuries, right? So he'd go out just as he was getting hot again, he'd leave. And you would see a lot of that from LaMelo, just trying to get a rhythm back. Defensively, unfortunately, the numbers would suggest that he had a very, very much so negative impact on that end of the floor, where if you're talking about Dennis Smith Jr., Bryce McGowan's, even just, any of the other players that would fill in for him, it's not like you're looking at Bryce and saying, oh, okay, yeah, he's a fantastic defender. Just even some of the numbers without LaMelo seeing the floor, the team defense would improve too. And in fact, if you looked post All-Star break, going into that Oklahoma City game after they had beaten the Dallas Mavericks twice, they posted the best defensive rating in all of the NBA post All-Star break, best transition defense numbers post All-Star break. So I think we learned a couple of things about LaMelo, both good and bad, given what happened this season with his impact on the lineup.
Yeah, I mean, I'll start with the offense. I think, there's some people could put it like it was like, having the car go from in gear to neutral or reverse when he went out. To me, it was a different car. I mean, it was like, going from one of LaMelo's Lambos when he's in there to my Ford Focus, because it was just.
You don't have a neon, shiny, bright Lambo like LaMelo does?
Not yet. If he's got, maybe when he puts one on a used lot, I'll go check it out. But yeah, it seemed disjointed. Roles were different and had to be different. The efficiency wasn't there. And obviously the pace wasn't there. It was just a completely different offense to watch. One was fun to watch. One was not fun at all to watch. But yeah, I think it is revealing that, the team has had its best defensive stretch without LaMelo. And as you said, transition defense without LaMelo. When I talk about Steve Clifford, kind of imparting some of these better habits, into this team, it's certainly not just the young guys. When I asked Cliff last week if he'd seen those habits kind of start to get better and set in for the young guys, he said, and the older guys too. So I think that is something that has kind of settled in at the end of the season. Maybe it's happened off the floor with LaMelo too. He's a great anticipatory, pass stealer. He has defensive skills, but obviously that is a weak part of his game. And, it's only his third year in the league. He played, I think, when he was healthy at an all-star level anyway. But it's just something that, you hope he still continues to get better at and wants to get better at.
Yeah, 100%. If we go to some other things that we've learned on this season, I think for the most part, that PJ Washington, he's going to get close to his $20 million a year asking price. And it's been what we've called a million times a roller coaster getting there. What you see from PJ at the very beginning of the season, immediately thrust into a role where he is the lead guy because of immediate injuries. And then he gives you the Golden State game where he goes for over 30. I think he goes for 27 early on this year as well. And then you talk about just trying to figure out what his identity is. You've got different players coming back and then leaving the lineup to where, he's trying to figure it out. Okay, am I the number one, number two, number three option? It changes so rapidly for him. And I think at the end, we saw him go on a really impressive stretch, and then eventually he gets hurt. So he ended, honestly, on a good note, right? Like there was only a few games left to be played. There wasn't any big time cool down games after his 40-point performance that he had against OKC. So there wasn't anything to take away that momentum except for the injury, right? But even with the injury, the thing you look at most recently is his 43-point performance. So he even ends on a good note. I wonder with PJ, still a polarizing player for Charlotte Hornets fans. Still don't know if they want to give him close to 20 million, what the line is for different fans out there. I do think with PJ, though, that was the guy that was as durable as anybody this season. I know Terry missed some time early, but PJ has been out there a lot. And I think we learned a lot about PJ, what he can do, what he consistently can do, and what his worth is in different roles. And I think that's valuable. I think it's also valuable enough to where the Hornets are going to pay him.
Yeah, and I think that close to 20 million sounds easier to swallow now than it did maybe a couple of months ago. And also, what are you going to do? Are you going to let him go? I mean, you're already kind of running this thing in reverse from where you were before this season. We don't know how the Miles Bridges situation is going to be resolved. We don't know what draft pick they're going to end up with. And outside of maybe one or two of them, how good that player is going to be next year. So I think they're in a position where they probably have to pay PJ Washington. And, on the team that I would envision, if I were running the Charlotte Hornets, he would be a piece in it. He wouldn't be the second option or the first option, but he would be able to, be somebody that could deliver nights like those, but also deliver nights where he's the primary defender and making huge stops. So I think he's probably going to get close to what he wants. And I think the Hornets probably have to do it. One thing I learned in addition is that the Hornets are a heck of a lot better at the center position leaving the season than they were coming into it. I think the development of Mark Williams, the continued development of Nick Richards, obviously he signed an extension. Outside of drafting Victor Wembanyama, I think they've got a decent future at that position. And I'm excited to see what else Mark Williams can bring to the table as he, continues to develop, because I think we've talked about it before. He's one of those players. We literally saw the development each time he went out there and how much better he got. And he used the G League experience, not as, a punishment or, a knock, to get better and be better prepared for when he was able to play in the NBA. And, he hasn't looked back since then. And, look, the rotations have been interesting. I know my friends who are fantasy owners and have Nick Richards and Mark Williams come playoff time, which was like, okay, how'd you end up in that position? But anyway, they're not too happy with the way things are going. And you'd love to see Mark out there every single night. But, as we're going to talk about, maybe rest is good for some of these guys, and young and old at this point.
The NBA season is on its head when there's somebody out there relying on Nick Richards' minutes to win their playoff game in fantasy basketball.
That's the first question I had.
Was Nick
Shout
Richards?
Out to Nick Richards, but how did you find yourself in this position?
Oh no. Goodness gracious. Yes, that's brutal. But also you're so right. That's probably the best one, is that the Charlotte Hornets came into the season needing desperately to upgrade at that center spot, which would have meant Mark Williams hits pretty quickly. He didn't hit quickly. He wasn't in the rotation very early on, as you mentioned, with him going down to Greensboro. And then he stepped into the rotation. And then quickly thereafter, everybody, okay, we've got a center now. It's working. Even Mason Plumley, it was not an embarrassment of riches by any means, but Mason Plumley was good enough for an active playoff suitor to come after Mason Plumley and the Clippers. And then you're talking about Mark Williams filling in that role, providing some level of rim protection. The rim protection numbers have been good for Nick Richards. The one-on-one defense isn't fantastic. He will punch it home. He's an awesome dunker. He's a great offensive rebounder. And so you have different skill sets to work with at center, unlike you used to last year and the years before that. So I think that's a great one. Let's continue that conversation coming up next on the Locked On Hornets podcast.
Don't go to sleep on the Hornets just yet.
Wanted to discuss a little bit more about some of the storylines we'll remember years from now that took place during the course of this past season. This episode is brought to you by FanDuel. The NBA playoffs are almost here, and now is the perfect time to download FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook, because new customers get a no-sweat first bet up to $1,000. That's bonus bets back if your first bet does not win. Just download the FanDuel Sportsbook app. It's safe, it's secure, it's super easy to use. Then you can bet on everything from the money line to point scores and even threes drained. Plus, FanDuel even lets you combine your bets for a chance at a bigger payout with a same-game parlay. Don't miss the chance to get your no-sweat first bet up to $1,000 in bonus bets when you go FanDuel.com/LockedOn. That's FanDuel.com/LockedOn to learn more. Make every moment more with FanDuel, an official sports betting partner of the NBA. One more segment to go. Locked On Hornets. All right, Nick, let's go to you again. The last couple storylines, maybe just individual storylines, stretches a player had, Steve Clifford comments, some of the things that the Hornets have done that you'll remember most from this year, because the injuries are crazy. We've talked about that. That is the theme of this season. But is there anything else that comes to mind that, okay, yeah, 5 years from now, you know what, I will look back at this fondly, or look back at this saying, okay, crazy ridiculous that stretch happened?
Yeah, it's tough to identify a lot of positives, but I think, Mark Williams, who we talked about, I won't dive back into that again, his development, and going from thinking, okay, like, is this going to be a bust situation, to very quickly, having a solid piece at center for the future. I don't know. Dennis Smith Jr. pops off top of my head, kind of the resurgence for him.
That's what I was going to go with.
Somebody that we forget how young he is. We forget how explosive he is until he basically levitates on dunks. Blocking Kevin Durant is probably, his best play of the season, despite all the highlight dunks. And I know, there are some flaws in his offensive game, but I just think as a, kind of a leader on this team and, what he brings energy wise defensively, I think they should keep him around. We'll see what they do there, but it just seems like it was yesterday that it was like Dennis Smith from Fayetteville and NC State, in the dunk contest with Jay Cole there at Spectrum Center.
Right.
Flash forward, he's like a 26-year-old that reminds me of a 35-year-old, not in his athletic ability by any means, but just in his mentality. And that was awesome. That was kind of unexpected.
Yeah, I think Dennis Smith Jr., that was the one I was going to go with. If we want to keep the what did we learn theme alive for this last one, we learned that Dennis Smith Jr. is an NBA player, and we learned that he's a different one than what he was supposed to be when he was drafted. The guy's identity completely changed. He 100% bought in. That was true at the beginning of the season, and he said that he and Steve Clifford think a lot of the same about the NBA game, and that's what allowed him to get this chance. Steve Clifford liked what he saw from DSJ, and he became one of the better perimeter defenders out there in a world where there's so much negative attention on the Hornets. And look, I'm not mad about it. It's been awful this season. But in that world, even national NBA pundits are talking about how great of a story Dennis Smith Jr. is. That guy made himself some money this season. Offensively, it can be rough, really from the shooting stroke, more so than anything. But he can facilitate. I think he does a good job on cutting to the basket. I think he does provide rim pressure, which is something that this team kind of needed with LaMelo still working that part of his game out. Love what you got from Dennis Smith Jr. I hope they bring him back as well. And if we want to go to some of the smaller ones, look, I just mentioned Mason Plumley. We're going to remember the left-handed pull-up jumpers, right? Yeah. I mean, that was plus the bench reactions.
The primary thing I will remember about Mason Plumley for years to come.
I literally have the T-shirt. I have been there, done that, watched it, and I literally have the T-shirt of the left-handed jumper from Mason Plumley. That is something I purchased this season. And you know what's funny? So again, me and Willie P over at WFNZ, we nicknamed him Mr. Steal Your Girl because both of our significant others would watch him do reverse dunks, and we'd be like, well, he's not the greatest in the world. And they'd both be like, wait, but why? Like, he's doing these reverse dunks.
The best player in the team. Yeah.
Why does he need to be on the bench? Really? Like, why you want Mark Williams? He's not blocked. He's not doing any reverse dunks. He's not shooting left-handed. And it's hilarious. It's like, all right, you're right. Mason Plumlee's the best. They traded him. They got an asset. But that's certainly one of the funnier, smaller storylines I'll remember.
Yeah, not to bring it down, but one of the biggest storylines I'm going to remember from this season happened literally days before the season started, and I'm saying it while wearing this sweatshirt. But, the trajectory of James Bouknight, first-round pick from 2021, obviously some issues with coaching his first year, and then we find out some really, significant off-the-court issues this year. And, being buried in Greensboro for a long, long time, kind of being forgotten about, being basically considered, unsalvageable for the Charlotte Hornets, but then having these really intriguing last couple of weeks and maybe, hearing the things he says about himself off the court, maybe he's kind of gotten through some of that. I'm not saying he has, but maybe. And then on the court, maybe he's found his game a little bit. at the NBA level and found some confidence. So I'm fascinated to see what happens with him going forward, because, I think he can be good for the Charlotte Hornets, and I think he can be an important piece. And I think when you talk about what we'll look back on 5 years from now, we'll probably know a lot of that and how that's shaken out either way. And, we'll point to those moments. The very beginning and the very end with James Bouknight have been completely opposite.
Yeah. Last thing I'll end on here is just kind of looking at some of the other players on the roster, not wanting to leave anyone out. Kelly Oubre, he said he wants to stay here. And look, Kelly's game, it changed at the beginning when he was attacking more. He was getting to his mid range. He was attacking the basket, and I even said that last year. Attacking Kelly Oubre is good. Kelly Oubre, when you're not settling for all of the 3-point jump shots and you're attacking, it's been fantastic. But even with the numbers being what they are, I don't think the numbers suggest that you should pay him at the expense of paying other players on the roster building towards the future. With all that being said, I've absolutely loved Kelly's attitude, even in the worst of times this season. It's been refreshing. It's been awesome to see him legitimately care, and it's not even in a selfish way being in a contract year. You know what I'm saying? Like, it's not when he goes for a dunk and then he stares you down, which I'm all here for, by the way. Give me all the stare downs after you just throw it down in someone's face. But it's also when somebody else does something awesome. He's the first one off the bench in court. He's ready to fight for you. And It's not like that's completely new from last year. It just seemed more evident during downtimes. And Kelly, even with his thoughtful comments at the podium, which he's always been better at the podium than most, but when he goes to the podium and then he discusses how these minutes do matter for Akai Jones, these minutes do matter for some of these younger guys, even if we can be realistic and acknowledge you're playing for next season, that's where that stuff is important. So I've just really enjoyed Kelly Oubre as a dude this year on and off of the court. And not to completely disparage his basketball ability, because it's been very helpful during an injury-ridden season. I've just really respected the guy that he's been this year.
Yeah, Kelly and Terry were the heart and soul of this team, and the reason why, despite all of the injuries, all of the things off the court that took guys away, and all of the losing, so much losing, those guys,
There's been some losing.
Those guys were the reason that things kept going. You didn't have as many kind of tank-like games as you would have thought. So, I give those guys a lot of credit. Yeah. And with Oubre, I mean, he's somebody else that we've learned a lot about the last few years. Just his personality. He's got the stare downs, but my favorite thing he does, I mean, he literally will like hit a three and look at the other team's bench and just laugh at them. I mean, it's maniacal.
He mixed it up this year.
100%. I absolutely love it. But yeah, I mean, he's not somebody that you need to score 20 points per game. He's probably not the guy you want to score 20 points per game if he's doing it in the way that he's doing it. From the 3-point line, obviously he was just over 30% this year, a little more inefficient than you'd like. And despite all that great stuff about Kelly Oubre Jr., they're probably going to look to find somebody that can come in and provide a little bit more efficiency from outside, because that's something they need.
Yeah, that's the ending theme, right? It's that they have so many different decisions to make heading into this offseason to try to get this thing back on track. And of course, hopefully LaMelo is fully healthy. He gets over the ankle voodoo magic that is cast upon them right now and what happened this season. And then you can start to make those decisions to get back on track. Playing for the play-in, hopefully an outright playoff spot. That's Nick Carboni of WCNC. You see it right there if you're watching YouTube. Follow him on Twitter at Nick Carboni, WCNC. We appreciate it, man. Thanks for the time as always.
You got it. See you next week.
All right, sounds good. That'll do it for Locked On Hornets. Thanks for making us your first listen. Make your second listen game-to-game NBA. Every single contest, every top performance, every result. Locked On Game-to-Game covers every game from across the league with local analysis that only Locked On can deliver. Follow Game-to-Game on Locked On NBA. Available on the Odyssey app, YouTube, and wherever you get your pods. Have a great rest of your day. We'll be back with you tomorrow.